In the previous two lessons, you learned about Swift variables and functions, and now you are ready to apply that knowledge to the work hard game. Let's take a look at how these two things can help us to change the images in the work hard game when the deal button is tapped on. Oh, and before we begin, if you missed the other two lessons, just click on the playlist right over here. All right, let's dive in. All right, so here we are finally back in the work hard game. Now, when you open up your project again, it might be missing a bunch of panels. They may have gotten closed due to some other projects you were working on. So you can go ahead and click this button to open up the navigators panel. And also this canvas, you can hit this blue button to load the canvas. Now I want to run the project so that we can remind ourselves what state the project is in. So the very first thing we're going to do actually is to work on this button. This is an image currently. So obviously you can't tap it. It doesn't do anything. It's just for display. Let's change that into an actual functional SwiftUI button. And remember that analogy I used about SwiftUI is kind of like working with Lego blocks? Well, you're about to get a new Lego block. That's the SwiftUI button. So locate the button image so I can see it here in my SwiftUI code. This is what we want to change. So let's just delete that for a second. And let me show you the syntax or the keywords, the SwiftUI code to represent a button. Before I show you the code, I want to tell you about a couple of different ways you can arrive at this conclusion yourself. Just so that in the future, if you are not sure how to do something, you can use these tools at your disposal. So one way is to use the AI assistant. So you can go ahead and ask, how do I add a SwiftUI button? Because you might know that something exists because you've seen it in another app or you've seen other people talk about it or you've heard them talk about it. You just don't know how to do it yourself. So this would be a perfect use case. So this is one way where you can see, what code represents a button. That's one way. Another way is that there's something called the library. So if you go to View and then you go to Show Library. So notice that the shortcut key for this is Command, Shift, and L. So you can always press that instead of going to this menu. And you might also have a button, a plus button here. Now it's not this little plus button that you see here. This is for adding a new tab. There, you might have another plus button there that would open this library pane. It depends on what version of Xcode you have and what sort of editor view that you have currently. But you can always press Command Shift L to launch this. And this is helpful because it gives you a library of all of the components in SwiftUI. So for example, on this first tab here under Views, you can see all of the different quote unquote Lego blocks at your disposal. You have the labels, you have the images, link, list, all these things. We're interested in button. In the future, you can also explore modifiers. We talked about what these are. They add different attributes, changing behavior and changing appearance of your views. These are the things down here where you see this text label. There's like a dot font, dot padding. Those are modifiers. So this is a list of those modifiers that you can use. And then there are several more here that are not as commonly used, at least for me. This one contains different APIs that you can access. And in non-technical terms, it means just allowing your app to speak to other things on the phone, perhaps the address book, perhaps different apps, perhaps like launching the browser, things like that. And then there's your media library. This one is useful for searching the images in your app. And then there's different things like that. The color library and SF symbols. Yeah, this is useful. So we've used a couple of these symbols back in lesson 3 when we were first learning about SwiftUI. But coming back to the button, what you can simply do is click and drag this into here. And there is your basic button. You'll notice that it matches what we have here in the code snippet in the AI panel, right? I think it's important that when we're learning how to code here and build iOS apps, to ask the AI panel how to do something rather than do this for me. Because when you ask how and you can read the explanation, you end up learning. If you just ask it to do it for you, there's less learning involved. Okay. So for this button, let's change this string inside. This is the piece of text that you're going to see as the button. So we're going to call this deal, and the action is going to be what happens when the button is tapped on. So let's do a simple print statement. And look at this. It's like in context. It's in context with our app. Okay, so I'm going to save it and let's rerun the app. You can actually even just use the canvas here. You should be able to see the button and also interact with it. All right, so you tap on this deal button and let's bring up the console here. So if you go in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see there's these different tabs that you can expand, right? So you can expand this tab here. You can see as I am tapping the deal button, you can see that it's executing the code in here. Okay, so that's a basic button. Pretty easy, right? Now you have another SwiftUI Lego piece to work with. However, this button doesn't look so good. We want to change how this button looks. So I don't know how to do that, right? Let's ask AI. Well, I do know, but I want to teach you to rely on this AI assistant because it's as good as having a mentor sit beside you. Ask AI. How do I use an image for the button? You can even say, how do I use the button image asset? And it'll give you the code, but it's done it for you. I was about to say that if you just ask it in a more generic way, you can apply the knowledge to your app in context. But this AI is so good that it has context of your project. It's literally just giving you the code that you need. So this is what this button looks like. You'll notice that it's formatted a little differently. It's got the keyword button, and then it's got a set of curly brackets. Inside this first set of curly brackets, we've actually got the action for the button, like what it does when it's tapped on. And then you have this label, colon, followed by another set of curly brackets. And in between the label curly brackets, you're putting the SwiftUI code that represents the button. So in this case, we're using the image view to add an image. And these modifiers are added to make sure that the image is the right size, essentially. So let's do this. Instead of copying and pasting, let's try to type this out ourselves to get some practice, right? So we are going to just have the keyword. You're going to have the curly brackets. Let's leave it as deal tapped. Okay, and then what did we have next? We have label, colon, and then set of curly brackets like that, followed by the image. So the image asset name is button, if you can remember. And then let's refresh the canvas and see if we can view it this way instead. All right, sure enough, we see the button. I'm gonna run the simulator so we can tap it just so we can see the print message. All right, sure enough, it is working. All right, so now we know how to use a SwiftUI button. Let's think about what we want to happen when this button is tapped, not just printing out something into the console window. We actually want to change the images, right? And we want to update the score labels. So let's take a look at the card images up here and think about how we can change them. This image right here, which we have coded, or we're pointing to the image asset card 11. If I change that 11 to 12, you're going to see, I might have to refresh the canvas here. It's refreshing, it's taking a little bit. See the jack change to a queen, right? If I change it to 13, you're going to see it change to a king. So this card 13 is pointing to the image asset. When we tap on this button, we want to change this to whatever card we've randomized it to. So how do you think that this button, the code that we write inside this button, can modify this data right here? If you think back on our Swift lesson on variables, we learned that you can assign a piece of data to a variable. And then whenever we wanted that piece of data, all we had to do was specify the variable name. So let's start by doing that. First, let's declare a variable and assign it the string data card 13. Where do we declare variables in here? Now this part, you have to be a little bit careful because there is a certain area which you're going to be declaring your variables inside this view. And that is right under this first line. So if you hit enter, create some space here, you're going to create a variable here. Now, do take note, you should recognize this var keyword from the variables lesson. This var body, this is declaring a body variable, right? And the data type, remember you can specify the data type of variables, is some view. And what we learned in the Swift lesson, the variables lesson, we use the equal sign to assign something to the variable. Now this looks a little bit different, right? It's got the curly brackets. Don't worry about it for now. This is what's known as a computed property. You'll learn about it in the future. Okay, so let's continue declaring our variable. Var, we're going to call this the player card, okay, because it's on the left side. Left side is for the player. So we're going to call it player card, and we're going to say equals card 13. If you wanted to, you could add the data type like that, but we can leave it out. It is implied from the data. Let's do the same thing for the CPU card. Card 10. Now let's come down here, now that we have these two variables, and change this. Instead of specifying the text directly in here, this is called hard coding it into the image. That's not what we want. Instead, we want to specify player card. And for this, we're going to specify CPU card. Now, this image is reading this variable and getting this piece of text. If I change this to 11, you're going to see that will also change because it is reading from that source, right? That variable. Okay, changed back to a jack. Same thing will happen for the CPU card. Okay. Now, because image is now reading from the player card variable, when the button is tapped and we randomize a new card for the player, we can actually change the image asset that player card points to simply by saying player card equals, let's say we randomized card 3, we will change it to card 3. Right? That is the benefit of making these point to those variables instead of just hard coding the text in there. I also want to use proper terminology here, although it may get a little bit confusing. So these are variables, but they're also known as properties of the content view. So player card is a property of content view. CPU card is a property of content view, and so is body. You can see that they all have the var keyword here. Now, before we move on, let's think about what else needs to happen when the deal button is tapped on. Aside from randomizing the cards and changing the card images, which we can now do because we've made these variables, we also need to calculate the scores and update the score labels. If you take a look at the score labels down here, we again have hard-coded 0 to the text. And so we won't be able to change that from the button. We need to, again, use properties to be able to access and change this value from the deal button. So let's add those as properties up here too. So let's say player score equals 0, and var CPU score equals 0 as well. Notice that instead of making these text, I'm going to make them numbers or integers because I want to be able to do math on it. I want to be able to add 1 to increment it. Down here, because a text label, it is expecting a piece of text, but now I'm trying to put an integer type variable into it, it's going to complain about that. So I'm going to try to put player score in here. You'll see that it recognizes that it's an int, but there's going to be an error. See, so let's take a look at what it's saying. No exact matches in call to initializer. What we have to do is actually convert this int to a string type before passing it to the text label. Now, if you encounter errors as you're building your app, again, let's see what the AI assistant can do for us. I'm encountering an error. Can you explain it to me? So instead of asking it to fix it, I'm asking it to explain it to me. So let's see what it says. Okay, player score is an int, but text expects something like string. Okay, so here are some ways to fix it. You're converting the int to a string, or you can use what's called string interpolation. But let's go with this one because it's easier to understand, I feel, for you right now, is you are treating that integer as a string. So the way to do that is, I'm going to add some spaces here to make it easier for you to read. So that's the SwiftUI text label, right? If you type in string with a pair of brackets and inside you put the player score, think of it as you're encapsulating this integer in a string. You're like putting a string disguise on it. The actual term this is called is casting. And just like this, you're not going to get the error. So rely on that AI assistant to explain the errors to you so you can read and learn. Don't just say fix it. And this is a valuable learning tool. Oops, not card, score. Look at all the errors that can happen when you're not paying attention. So now that these two text labels are reading from player score and CPU score, when the button is tapped, I can also update them. I can say player score is going to be equal to player score plus 1. This is like adding 1 to the current player score. Another way to write this, as you'll see, is actually just plus equals 1. So then you're incrementing it by 1. If you do minus equals, you're going to be minusing 1 from the player score. Okay, but we're going to tackle this in the next lesson, and we're going to talk about why it's actually throwing an error. But before we move on to the next lesson, there's one more thing I want to integrate into this project right now, and that is the use of functions. When this button is tapped, we could write all the code inside this button. Or we can group that code into a Swift function, and then when this button is tapped, we just call that function. Now, what's the benefit? In this context, you could just put the code in here because the only place that uses that code, that series of commands, is the button. But in the future, as you're building other apps, there may be a series of commands that get used in multiple places, and you don't want to put that code in multiple places. You don't want to duplicate code. That's one of the golden rules of software development. You want to reuse as much as possible. So a function will let you do that because you can put that series of commands into a function, and then you can call that function from any place in your app project that you want. And you only have that series of commands in one place. Okay, so I'm going to get you into the habit of doing that. Let's create a function. Can neatly group all of the randomizing of the cards and calculating the scores in one place. Now, where do we put the function? That is easy to make a mistake. I want to teach you about code folding. That is just a way to modify what you see here to make it easier to work with your code. So if you put your cursor right under body, or you could just put it right after this curly bracket right here, and you go to editor at the top, and you go to code folding, you can choose fold. Take a look at that command as well, that shortcut key. By doing that, it basically just collapses all of the code in between the two curly brackets. And if you wanted to expand it again, you can just double tap it like that. So go ahead and fold it up to make it a little easier to read. So that's code folding and fold it up. And then what I want you to do is this curly bracket, you see when I put my cursor on it, there's a flash of yellow. That tells me where the corresponding bracket is, the pair, because they're always in pairs. So I click this, it tells me that this is the closing bracket for that opening bracket. what I want you to do is create a couple of lines right before this closing bracket. So I hit enter here. I basically want to do that. So after the closing bracket of the body, but before the closing bracket of the content view. So it should look like this. We're going to have function, and then we're going to have deal cards. And then we have a pair of rounded brackets, and we have a pair of curly brackets. And inside here, we're going to put all of that code. Randomize card values, update the card images, calculate the score, update the score labels. And now we can double tap on those 3 dots to expand the body again. And inside the button, instead of just writing lines and lines of code in here, all we need to do is say deal cards, and that is it. When this button is tapped on, it is going to call deal cards. You can right click and you can jump to definition, and that will come here, and you can see how this function is defined. Remember, if you've accidentally declared the functions in the wrong place, you're getting an error, use AI right here. So let's say I accidentally, I'm gonna move this. Actually, I'm gonna make a mistake right here. Let's say I accidentally declared the function inside the body. That. Okay, I'm gonna get an error. So what is my error? You don't understand why this is happening, okay? Say you're getting this error because you declared this function inside the body. How to fix it? Move the function out of the body and make it a method. Okay, so it's gonna try to show you that where you should put it. Okay, so move this function. It was like in there before. You're gonna move it. This is the function, right? Gonna move it right before the closing bracket right there of the content view. Easiest thing to do is just to grab that function, do Command X. Okay, that's a bunch of empty space. We're gonna go back up here, put my cursor there, and let's fold the code again so it's easier to read. And then you know where you want to add it is right there, right after the closing bracket of the body, but before the closing bracket of the content view. I'm going to paste my function right there. And also, if you're having trouble with this lesson, you can download my Xcode project in the link in the description of this video. We're on the home stretch. Now that we've added Swift variables and functions into the project, we are set up to change the images when the deal button is tapped on, as well as to compute and update the scores. So that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson. Don't miss it. I'll see you there.